Hi, my name is Callie McGarry, and I will be sharing a presentation on survivors of domestic abuse. So domestic abuse is violence within a domestic situation, home, family, or relationships. And intimate partner violence is a little more specific to violence within a romantic, dating, or sexual relationship, but the two terms are used interchangeably. But violence I'll be talking about today will be any form of violence: physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, or even financial. These are all under the umbrella of domestic abuse. I wasn't able to find any local statistics, but statewide, as you can see, 18% of females, 10% of adults were affected by domestic abuse in 2016. That's in Utah. And then nationally, about 10 million men and women are abused every year, and internationally, 30% of women have been abused at some point in their lifetime. I found another statistic that I didn't add here, but 137 women are killed by a member of their family every single day within the U.S., I believe. Or maybe that's the world. I think that one's the world. And then social determinants of health. Things that affect or are barriers to these victims of domestic abuse. They obviously are living in unsafe living environments, neighborhoods. Physical activity and job opportunities may be decreased. Limited access to health care. And a lot of this could be because of physical injuries that they're receiving, or even neurological deficits because of that. Or a lot of the time, the perpetrator likes to have power and control over the victim and may limit the opportunities or access to healthcare that that person has. And risk factors for this kind of violence: low income and education, mental illness, drug use, and lack of community support. So concerns, we obviously are very concerned about physical injury. Pretty large percentage of these survivors had a physical injury, and I was interested to learn that a lot of them may suffer from chronic health conditions as well. As I was doing research, I learned that a lot of domestic abuse victims will engage in risky behavior like drugs or alcohol to kind of cope or to numb some of the pain, emotional pain from the abuse. I work at a jail, and a lot of the women I've talked to that have gotten into drugs, it's based from childhood or domestic abuse. And then psychosocial concerns: a lot of them have depression, PTSD, anxiety, or other mental illnesses. And as you can see here, it's also really common for there to be financial struggles. The perpetrator may use their own finances and stability kind of as hold it over the victim's head to keep the victim there or to control the victim, and the victim will stay just to avoid poverty or homelessness. So, talking about the root cause and why these victims are at risk for health inequalities, a large percentage of victims are fearful or hesitant to reach out to get that emotional or medical help for fear of retaliation of the perpetrator or for fear of opening up that part of their lives to someone else. And obviously the root of the problem stems from the abuser, the perpetrator themselves. And ironically, a lot of the perpetrators have suffered abuse themselves, and it's either trauma or learned behavior. A lot of perpetrators have low self-esteem, mental instability, or having stressors in their life, possibly using drugs as well. So depending on the situation, physical needs may or may not be met for domestic abuse victims. Self-actualization, that's another one that could be possibly met. A lot of them may use their creativity to help them to cope with the situation, but obviously needs like safety needs, love and belonging, self-esteem, those are all not present at all. There are a few phases of abuse, and during that honeymoon phase, which is the phase after the perpetrator has injured or the tension's built and there's a battery incident. After that phase is the honeymoon phase, where the perpetrator tries to convince the victim to stay and convince that it's going to be better and won't happen again. And during that phase, according to the research I was looking at, a lot of the women are actually able to function pretty well and have the hope that things will get better. But any injury or emotional distress will impair the functionality. And it's just all dependent on if the health outcomes, if survivors are able to get help or not. They can have good lives and have good outcomes and stop the cycle of abuse, but there can be some consequences that are hard to get rid of, like psychological trauma. So, depending on the abuse and the situation, they are at risk for sexually transmitted diseases, any physical injuries, and if they're not receiving the appropriate medical care, could turn into infection. So prevention, as nurses, it's important to be aware of these signs of sexual abuse, such as bleeding from the anus, pelvic pain, if the person's walking a little funny, children having sexual knowledge that you typically wouldn't think they should know, discomfort with undressing, bruises, and then also looking for physical abuse, bruises, cuts, scrapes, fractures, swelling, pain. And it's important for us to treat those wounds and to report any suspected abuse. So I was interested to learn in my research that victims of domestic violence, they're at increased risk for some other diseases like asthma, fibromyalgia, headaches, hypertension, insomnia, chronic pain, GI disorders, and gynecologic disorders as well. Self-care and self-harm. Unfortunately, a lot of victims, due to the situation, feel that the abuse is their fault, that they're the reason that this is happening, and it causes a sense of hopelessness and lack of control over their life and themselves. And so self-care typically doesn't happen for someone who's in this situation. I think that a survivor of domestic abuse has obviously made some steps toward self-care, getting themselves out of the situation, so with the appropriate help they could receive the needed care. As well, self-harm. There's a lot of research that victims and even survivors of abuse are at increased risk for self-harm and suicide as well, which is really sad. So it's important to be the resource for those people to get the help they need and realize that they didn't do anything wrong and that they're needed here. Risk for harm by others. An article I read said 75% of those who are being domestically abused will continue to be abused, and that's a super high percentage. It's something that we need to work together to decrease. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of abuse victims, not a lot, but a portion of them will become perpetrators of abuse. And it just depends on the person, how they cope, if they were able to receive therapy and peel back those layers and work through things and receive the healing that they needed for such a horrible thing. It's a complex thing, but obviously a lot of people go through abuse and not all of them turn into abusers themselves, so it's important to do the necessary interventions so that people don't become like that and they can stop that cycle of abuse. And here are my references. Thank you for watching.